Hey guys, Andrew Esquire here, giving you the legal mindset on big tech and monopolies. Guys, this is really important for 2020 because antitrust monopoly law is going to be applied to big tech. So we're going to get into that today and talk about antitrust law, what it is, where it came from, and why it's important today. So let's start with what is antitrust law. Well, antitrust law dates way back. I'm talking way back, guys, to the late 19th century, the Gilded Era. This is a time when you heard of the robber barons, the extremely wealthy people who owned these giant estates in America based on the money they made from the Industrial Revolution during that period of time where they were making riches after the Civil War when the industry was building up again. Now, we're talking about magnates like J.P. Morgan. You may have heard of J.P. Morgan because he had a steel company that was vertically integrated. They owned every step of the steel production process, both from taking it out of the ground all the way up to manufacturing it in a vertical monopoly. But the big daddy, the OG, the GOAT for monopolies was John D. Rockefeller. You may have heard of a little thing called Rockefeller Center. Yeah, named after that guy. He was the richest man in the world. And if you convert his peak wealth into 2020 dollars, he'd still be the richest man in the world. But how did he do it? Well, he started with a company called Standard Oil. Now, this was during the oil boom when oil was becoming the fuel of choice, moving off of coal and towards oil. He started with a very small company, but what he did was acquire all the means of production, distribution, transportation, anything related to oil he acquired. And he believed firmly in economic survival of the fittest. He believed it was best for the country, best for the nation, best for the citizenry, best for the economy, if only the fittest companies survived. Therefore, if they couldn't take the competition, they didn't deserve to be in the mix. So he went through a spree of acquiring companies, of forcing other companies he dealt with not to do business with his competitors by setting prices that were so low they drove competitors out of business. And through all these practices together, after a couple decades, Standard Oil controlled 91% of both the manufacture and distribution of oil in the United States, almost a total monopoly on oil. Now, the regulators finally said enough is enough, and they cracked down on Standard Oil. The first antitrust laws were passed in 1890, but it took until 1914 for them to bring Standard Oil to task, to set the trial, and finally order the dissolution or breakup of Standard Oil into its component parts. Essentially, Standard Oil had to break out all of those smaller companies that it had previously acquired, and therefore it fractured its once huge trust into many entities. And because Standard Oil was formed as a trust, the laws that broke up that trust are called antitrust laws. Now, this was in a time when the government was very concerned about preserving competition. But the problem is that the antitrust laws, those laws that we have on the books, were written very broadly. They weren't very specific, and they gave the regulators a ton of discretion in how to choose to enforce those laws. So what we've seen over the last century with antitrust is that it greatly depends on the political winds and the sentiment of the public. So we went into the First and Second World War. And during these wars, when we're fighting Japan, we're fighting Germany, we're all across the globe, the government needed a close relationship with business. It couldn't afford to be fighting business. Therefore, it allowed businesses to become big once again. It allowed these large companies to dominate industries. But following the First and Second World War, we once again went into a period where politicians were very concerned about competition. And why? Well, that's because they saw the rise of communism and single state parties after World War II. They were also afraid, looking back at World War II, that having large industries, for example, war industries, control the economy could lead to fascism. So when looking at fascism and communism and not wanting to go either way, the United States decided to break up companies to ensure that we had competition at all levels so things remain fair, so they protect the consumer, so prices were preserved, so that nobody was gouged. So in the 50s and 60s, we went on a spree of breaking up companies, the most famous of which is one you may have heard of, AT&T. AT&T controlled the entire telecommunications sphere. You couldn't make a call if it wasn't AT&T. But the court and the regulators pressed AT&T, and after 2 decades pushing from the 60s all the way to the 80s under Ronald Reagan, and finally broke up that monopoly on telecommunications. But what happened in the 80s? You had another guy, Ronald Reagan. A lot of you weren't born then, but I'll tell you a little bit about him. Ronald Reagan, he liked business, and he came into office on the platform of taking the government's boot off of business. He said, hey, we're gonna step back. And part of that was, we're gonna step back on antitrust law. We're not gonna go through this whole cycle that we went through in the 50s and 60s, ending with AT&T. We're going to let it go. And what else happened in the 80s? Tech became a thing. Tech exploded under this era where the government decided to let companies be, where they eased up and stepped back from the regulation of tech. So for the past 3 decades, we've had an explosion in tech companies, which have become massive. But the issue is that we look at today in the modern era is, are these tech companies occupying the field? Are they so big that they make it hard for competitors? Now it seems we finally may have bipartisan support for looking deeply into tech company monopolies. In 2019, big tech was brought before Congress for antitrust investigations. Google, Facebook, Microsoft, all these companies were looked at very carefully. Now, Facebook went so far as in certain emails to say it is better to buy the competition than compete with them. And if we look at what some companies have done, for example, Facebook, by acquiring their competitors, Instagram, WhatsApp, they've become so big that the government has finally had to turn to whether or not antitrust law should apply, whether or not they are monopolies that should be broken up. Another key concern is whether or not they have a monopoly on our private information. Privacy is a new concern in the modern era. You now have companies that have access to your data across multiple platforms. And by entering data into one platform, you may be giving that company data that it can use across several platforms. That's concerning. And that violates, in the eyes of regulators at least, the spirit of antitrust law. So do not be surprised if you see regulators increasingly coming after tech companies. And we see this now with the investigation of Facebook, even late in the Donald Trump presidency. What's known as the lame duck session, we've seen regulators file suit against Facebook. And now while Facebook looks back and says, hey, regulators, you approved us acquiring WhatsApp, you approved us acquiring Instagram. The regulators don't care because they have support and political will to move forward. And from what it looks like, this is a Democratic and Republican thing. So Joe Biden coming in, another head of the FTC being named, won't stop this trend. And guys, that's all we're gonna cover today for antitrust and monopolies. But if any questions, comments, please leave them in the video below. But until next time, this episode is adjourned.